Over the years, I've talked in front of various groups of various sizes, but I don't think any of them were as intimidating as when I actually talked to a group of Kinawley people. Several of you here will know my breed, seed and generation, but there may be some of you, some of the youngsters who don't. So just to start off, I'll give you a wee bit of background about myself. I've lived outside, a couple of miles outside Enniskillen now for almost 53 years. And before that I was in Belfast for 4 years. And yet, whenever I drive up through Killesher or come past Mountain Cross, I still get a feeling that I'm coming home. And if this works for me, Ryan, you might have to come to my help here, is it not? Ah, this map partly explains why. It's a map that I used. I was talking now with a genealogy group in Derry Lane a couple of years ago, and I used this map to show them where, when I was growing up in Kinawley, where my near relatives lived. Aunts, uncles, first cousins, second cousins. And I knew them all. And indeed, when we came to live in Kinawley here, our home, because of its location, I suppose, became a hub for the wider family, and indeed for many other people who weren't part of the family. There wouldn't have been many days, but there was some people in, and indeed not many nights either. My mother's teapot rarely cooled. And yet, so my roots are very deep in this part of the country. But I wasn't born in Kinawley. I first arrived in Timor. My father's home had been in the townland of Moharay, far south of Swanland Bar, but a mile above Killaduff graveyard. And although my grandfather came from much nearer here, he came from down below Cassidy's Cross in the townland of Irvine. My second cousin, Tom Maguire, still lives in the home where my grandfather grew up. Tom's grandfather and my grandfather were brothers. And my grandfather had gone off, like many people at that time, had gone away to America. But he and his brother Mick came back for a visit. So they must have done all right. They came back for a visit somewhere in about 1890 or early 90s. And while they were home, their mother persuaded them to buy a farm in Moharay. And Mick realised very quickly that they bought the farm, but he realised that it wasn't such a good idea, and he headed back to America and left my grandfather there. And in 1894, he married a woman from just above the Balmore side of Derncreeve, Ellen McManus. And Ellen's story, I could take a whole night on that, because her family had originally come from down near the Remain Bridge, but they had fled from there in 1829, and some of you will probably know why they went at that time, as many families did. It was after the Mackin fight, and a lot of people had to leave. And they sought refuge in Glangevlin, which was a sort of a no-go area at the time for the yeomanry and people like that. So that's how she came. They had moved down from Glangevlin. But anyhow, to get back to Moharay, that's where my siblings were born. I'm the youngest of 6, and my brother and my 4 sisters were all born in Moharay. But at the end of the hungry 30s, my father sold the farm there, and during the war years, when there was a big demand by by farmers for people to work, the big push to grow crops and so on during the war. He came across into Fermanagh, and that's who I came to be born in Timor. My mother, however, was from Kinawley. Our home was in Carn, and about a mile from the main road up the side of the hill. And nobody's lived there now for over 60 years. The land has been leased, but it's still in the family. A nephew of mine owns it now. So I think she always wanted to get back to Kinawley. And in 1949, we moved to Tarubin, just down the road here. And it's from that time that my memory of Kinawley dates from that time. I know that many people here will have memories that are better than mine, in the sense that they can remember more. And indeed, there are one or two people that I can see here who might even be a little bit older than me, so their memories may go back farther. So what I would like you to do as I ramble on for the next while is to chip in at any time and add to what I may be saying, or correct me if I get things wrong, or indeed ask questions, because if I can't answer them, I'm sure there are people here who will. When Paddy Gabriel and I first talked about this the way back, we talked about maybe 9 or 10 of us gathering together and just talking, just having a chat about what things were like way back years ago. A bit like what people used to do around the fire when they were on their Cayley years ago. And somebody would talk about something and somebody else would pick it up, and the conversations would go off in all sorts of different directions. So I'd be quite happy, in fact I would welcome it if you chip in as maybe something I throw up here reminds you of something. And of course I'm very much aware that there are people, Paddy Maguire for instance, has written in great detail a remarkable account of the much wider area and what went on, but a lot of it with what Paddy wrote about is what I'll be touching on, maybe a wee bit of a different slant on it. But Paddy, feel free to jump in at any time and you know, elaborate on anything I'm saying. So, this is a different type of problem. Right. Yeah, my first couple of years down at Tarubin coincided with the building of the hall, of the rebuilding of it, because there was a hall there already. And the halls in rural Ireland there's an interesting history to them. They started to pop up in the 1930s. Often started up by people who had come back from America, such as John McGivern and Glenfarne, who built the Rainbow Ballroom, which is still there. But they often faced resistance. The church didn't approve. These were seen as places of sin. And of course the belief was, maybe it still is the case, that if you went to a place of sin, the actual business of going there to an occasion of sin, that in itself was a sin. Plenty of sins around those days. But there was resistance, and indeed there was one case in County Leitrim, a few miles from Carrick-on-Shannon, where a man had come back from America again and had established a hall, and he was actually forced. He met so much resistance that not only was he forced to leave, the church got the Valera involved, and he was deported. It's the only case in the history of Ireland where an Irishman has been deported from Ireland. So that was the strength, the power that some people had at the time. But by the 1940s, there was a realization in the church that they weren't going to win this struggle unless they actually took control. So they began to actually build parochial halls, or where possible, take over an existing hall. And of course they had also realised that there was a fair bit of revenue to be got from these dance halls. In the case of Kinawley, there was the hall down at Tarugan was owned by a man called Charlie McManus. Now I remember Charlie vaguely. I don't know whether he had been to America or not, but I do remember him as dressing quite neatly. And he wore a hat. The hat has stuck in my mind that the hat he wore was a little bit different from what other people wore. So he fitted in. He had come back from America. He was originally from Derryclagg. But towards the end of the 40s, Father Martin, who was the curate here on behalf of the parish, bought the hall, and then the redevelopment started. And as I say, my first memories really, I was only about 5, but I spent a lot of time on what was the building site. No health and safety concerns at the time. The men I remember there, the builders, well, they were tradesmen because they did more than just build, they did about everything, I think. Frank McTague, and a McManus man, I think he was Joe, I'm not sure of his first name.
Joe, that's right.
Joe. And Frank McTague came from Bootswallen Bar, but Joe, if I remember correctly, came from down below Cassidy's Cross. And he had a brother, Pat, who used to walk down here to play cards in later years. I think they may have lived where Paddy Maguire lives today.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yep.
That's it.
So,
The last night that they're doing the talk, remember they're talking about the cave or the thing up in the mountain. Some of that belonged to the McManuses. The McManus was involved in that talk that night as well. Yeah.
well, that in fact, those McManuses again, going back to the earlier McManus I mentioned, they were related to me as well, but I'm not sure what that relationship
And
was.
they're also related to my mother.
There we are. That's very knowledge what they share with us. The labourer was Mick Smith. And my memory of Mick is, now he probably didn't do it all the time, but my memory is of mixing cement. Every day he seemed to be mixing cement with a shovel. And no machinery. Mick came from Derra, away in at the end of Clonliff Lane. He was brother of Jerry's, who lived in the village here. And Mick, after the work finished, like most of his generation, Mick went off to England and lived there for the rest of his life. And there was another Smith man. Now, I don't know whether he worked at the building of the hall, but certainly once it was built, he was an important man.
Jimmy Smith.
Francie, I think. Francie would have been from Clonfane, but I think when I knew him, he was living with a sister of his in Acklanado.
They used to like to sit around.
Yeah, he was responsible for preparing the hall, cleaning it up afterwards, and one of the things that sticks in my mind is the Catherine and Cochrane, I think it was, truck coming with the minerals. That was all that was sold in the place at the time. And Francie actually would have been a frequent visitor in our house at that time. There's Terry, who was, again, would have been well known around Kinawley. He was a brother of Francis. So, you mentioned Tilly's Andy. That would have been the lighting that was in the hall at the time, because that didn't come for a good while later. So that, in fact, would have been, that alone was a big job for those doors. Yeah. The hall opened on the 22nd of July 1951. Now, I suppose you would expect a big grand opening or reopening, that you'd have a big dance or maybe a show, a concert of some kind. It was none of those things. It opened with an anti-partition meeting. The anti-partition movement in Kinawley was very strong at the time. And Cahir Healy, of course, was the MP, and along with him was Senator O'Hare, who was the Senate, that was the Senate in Stormont. He was the national senator there. He was also the editor of the Fermanagh Herald. And there was a band parade and a torchlight procession. Now again, I have a vague memory of this, and I could be confused because the following year, Cahir Healy was back here again, and in 1954 there was another big anti-partition meeting. So the anti-partitionist movement was strong and continued for a number of years. I remember being in the hall with Cahir Healy speaking, but I doubt if it was in 51. I'd say it was more likely to be in the 54 one. The band, there's only one person I remember in the band, and that was Francie Drum. And the Francie, I think, played the big drum. And that, I think, is why he, to my 5 or 6 year old self, that's why he stayed in my memory. And of course, in later years, I was to know Francie very well. Now, I know there were obviously plenty of others in the band. The Cathcarts, Hughie and John, was there Francie Cater? Cruggins.
I have the full list of band members at home.
Have you? So and the band went well for a number of years anyway. I don't know how long it lasted.
47 to 56.
As long as that. Yeah, and it was the fife and drum. Now, I've seen it referred to as the Emmets, but also the St. Nal's band, so to speak. And now, once the hall opened, of course, then dances, closely supervised in those days. There's a lot of stories about the early dances and the control that the clergy had on the dances. This was before the big show band era, but one of the most successful bands in the late 50s and 60s, on into the 70s, was a band called the Melody Aces, mainly from around Oma. And in later years, 3 of them played as a group, and I got to know them very well and had many conversations with them. And they would have told me stories about playing to a full house in Carnegie Hall in New York, but also playing to small groups in rural dance halls all over Ireland. And they told me about one dance hall somewhere down the west, where the priest used to stand at the side of the stage, and he would tell them when to start, and then he would tell them when to finish. That's the one dance. And they had to finish when he said so, because he estimated that there was a certain amount of time you could allow a boy and a girl to be close to each other. If it went on any longer, then that occasion of sin that I mentioned would be.
He'd get his eyes open if he was about to do it.
And in fact, he used to stop them, I think, usually after 3 numbers. And I'm not sure, but I think that's another way, even yet, I suppose bands often stop after they do 3 numbers. Well, the origin may be with priests like that guy that reckon that was long enough. And there had to have to be a pause then, there had to be 5 minutes or so of cooling off period. Now, as I said, this was before the big show band era, but the area was lucky in that it had 2 very good bands. The Sunbeam, the Red Sunbeam. The Red Sunbeam was, the main men in that were the Gilheenies from above Swan and Bar. And Jazzy McGovern was also well known. Jazzy would have again come from down below Cassidy's Cross. Some of his family are still around and around Enniskillen.
Jazzy's the drummer.
Jazzy was the drummer. And I think Leo Tapster was from Enniskillen. I'm not sure about the others. Ben Curran, I think, was a cousin
There's a
of
couple of the
Paddy Maguire.
doctors.
That's right.
All right. I don't know who the Rosalie Cosgrove or Joyce was. One of the Gilleanies, the son of one of them, became he was in the Drifter showband with Joe Dolan for many years, and then in the Times showband, I think.
Died last year.
He died there within the last year or so.
Joe.
And the other band then was the Starlight, and it was often referred to as the Derry Lynn Starlight. And again, you can see the line up there. Jimmy Gunn, Jimmy was a taxi driver, and I don't think he was actually in the band, but he'd have provided some of the transport. And John Joe McManus from Acklamad, Maureen, his daughter, lives there all the time. John Joe was their manager. And Brian Gallagher is still around. And it was Brian who actually gave me this photograph. And he told me an interesting thing about the band. You see the stands here for their music? Well, there's only two people in the band who could read music. Brian and his brother Sean. But every time when they were out on stage, Brian was responsible for providing the music. So he would come out and he would put the music down in the stands. And the music was old exam papers or anything that he could get his hands on that might fool the people into thinking that this was music. And of course, the trouble was when they weren't reading the music, they would forget to turn it. And John Joe McManus used to stand at the side of the stage, and every so often he'd say, "Turn the pages, boys, turn the pages." Now, at that time, and indeed for quite a while afterwards, football clubs, Gaelic clubs, weren't allowed to run the sort of dances that the Sunbeam and the Starlight would have played. Céilís only were allowed. And the admission, of course, there, you notice, is 2 and 6 and half a crown, which for those of you who aren't old enough to remember, would be 12.5p today. It doesn't seem much, but half crowns weren't that easily come by back in the 50s. But the area also had a Cayley band, the Harp of Erin. And you'll notice that there's a bit of a crossover that John McManus, John Mully, played in both the Starlight and this. Pat the Ford and Tommy the Ford, they came from about, I think, Mullineen, this bit of Derry Lynn. And of course John Mully was from Acklamad. Tommy Maguire was well known around Kinawley, Tommy Vetty. Now this was Brian's note here, the two at the back are called named Brendan and Keller. Well, I've been in Francie, I assume that's Francie Keller. And I'm not sure which of the Brennans it is, it might be John Patrick. But I don't know if he was in the band, he might have been there. Just again, maybe provided some of the transport, or maybe he was in the band, I don't know. So the area was rich in musicians. During Lent, of course, there were no dances. But concerts were held. And my memory of being involved through the football club in later on, around about 1960, the early 60s, organising these concerts. As far as I remember, there used to be 3 each Lent. And they were divided between the parish and the football club. I don't know whether it was the parish at 2 and the football club 1, or the football club 2 and the parish 1. And you would get people, in this case here it was Swan and Bar, although I don't remember them coming in the years that I would have been in any way involved. But Drumlane is one area that sticks in my mind, that there always seemed to be a very good drama group in Drumlane. And sometimes somebody would have to go to the border to transport them down because there was a hard border at the time. The usual format was that the visiting group would put on this play, but for an hour or so beforehand, local musicians and singers would provide variety. And Tommy Vetty, that was mentioned there, was a regular. Some of the Fords would have also played. And the best musician of all, of course, was John Joe Maguire, John Joe the Pup. John Joe might play and he might not. It was never clear what way he was going to be. But when he did play, he was excellent. And then there would be a few people who would sing. And my memory of the songs is that they all seem to be very sad songs. Mickey Vetty would get up and sing about a Fraulein that he had left behind on the banks of the old River Rhine. And then he would sing about a blind child in an orphanage that nobody wanted. Frankie, I think, he would have sang.
Yeah, and he sang with the Harp of Aaron Keeley Band.
That's right, yeah. And funny enough, the other person that I remember being very reluctant and was trying to persuade him to sing was Gailey.
Yeah,
who, of course, now is well known across Ireland as a traditional singer, but at that time, I don't know if we ever managed to get him to sing, but certainly if we did, it wasn't really good. What about yourself?
He sang, no, I never could be coaxed. Several times I never could be coaxed on the stage. But Gailey sang once, or if not, with Frankie and my sister and I, as a trio. But it was only they see in the early life he was more into pop music and stuff like that. And then
he wouldn't have fitted in with the...
see, I kept the tradition of the traditional music, I kept that going, and I was playing accordion. And then I got kind of involved in so many things, like there wasn't playing accordion much, and I gave him the accordion. And for over 60 years I never played a tune until recently, and I'm...
You're back then. There were other people who weren't so reluctant. I remember on one occasion a man going out to sing, and the usual thing was that you sang, and if there was a bit of applause, then you sang another song, and then you got off. He sang the two songs, then he went into a third one, and I think he may have actually got stuck into a fourth one, until eventually he had to be, maybe not forcibly removed, but certainly persuaded. Tony, do you remember that?
I do indeed. Quite well.
So, this was also the time when I would have gone to my first football matches, down Graffy in Cairns Field. And I would have had a particular interest at that time in the local team, because on any one day, at least, well, certainly up to half of the team would have been my cousins. McManus's, McCormick's, Greens and Rileys would, again, Paddy, you've produced the history of Cairns Field, which is a great record. And you've laid out some of the teams in it, and I would be right in thinking, Paddy, that those four families that I mentioned would have, for a number of years, made up about half the team. There was also the Currys, Johnny and James, not so many from this end. And there was a time actually towards the late 50s when there was a potential split in the club, because some of us started going up the Corrameen Road to practice in a bit of cutaway bog. The Bog Hollow, we call it. And I don't remember how long that lasted. It must have been a couple of years that we used to go up there. And because the club had been drawn most of its players from down Croton Creve and Mudgett, and the people up at this end were a wee bit alienated, I think. But anyhow, That problem was solved by when Moore Meadow was acquired. Moore Meadow is, I'm not sure where exactly it would fit in with the present park,
About the middle of the first field.
but it was a great improvement because it was flat. Cairns Field was not flat, it was the slope, and Moore Meadow was also dry. It was along the river. We did have to go in through two small fields to get to it. And of course there were no changing facilities or anything like that, but it was a big step up from Cairns Field. And from then on, I think the club was much more widely based. Reports in the paper of matches are not very detailed, but I was delighted to find one report. The matches, of course, were very strongly, and strongly is an appropriate word, were very strongly contested. And if Kinawley was playing Derry Lynn, there was a particular strength applied. And I was delighted to find one report of a match in which, from May the 30th, 1954, Kinawley actually beat Derry Lynn in Derry Lynn, and one of the people who scored 2 points was Aidan Leonard. They didn't manage to spell your name right, Aidan, but they got in the 2 points. The way football was played at the time was a lot different from now. And the approach to it is, I think, can be illustrated by a story I have. In 1969, I worked for the summer over in the States. And I spent some time there with my cousin Thomas McManus. And Thomas, like most immigrants, loved to talk about his young days back at home. And in his case, he was particularly fond of and had a great memory for matches that he played. And on one occasion, he was telling me about going to Adamsea to play, and about how they gathered this team together. And they got a bus to take the team and the supporters, probably not that many supporters. And then he said to me, your brother James, he said, we brought him along too. Now my brother James, I should explain, this is him on the far side there, this is me. It was taken down at True, and anyone recognise, well I know some people will recognise the boy in the middle. Anyone else recognise it? Him and your brother does.
Simon Anderson.
No, it's James Smith.
Oh.
Remember James?
Yes, very well.
Now James, obviously wherever he was coming from must have been important, because he's all dolled up with a tie and shirt and all the rest. And he must have stopped by, and some of my sisters, I think, was around when he came and took that photograph. But as I say, James was 15 years older than me, but he was a much bigger man than me. Or certainly a bit bigger. And Thomas said, we brought your brother James along too. And I said to him, but James didn't play much football. He wasn't much good, was he? Ah, no, he said, no, he wasn't much good. But he was great at knocking people down. So that was one of the qualifications. Now, Moore Meadow developed into the wonderful facility that's there now. And that is, a credit, is something that the community, well, I know is proud of, and deservedly so. None of us could have imagined in the Moore Meadow or Cairns Field days that Kinawley would have what it has up there. It is just remarkable. And my family, my side of the family, of course, are very proud of it because it's named after my first cousin. And nowadays, well, for years indeed, when any of my nieces and nephews are visiting, or others from the wider family, or nowadays, as in this case here, my grandnieces or grandnephews come to visit, I always take them up there to show them the field and tell them about their cousin and why it's named after him. And Patrick was very much involved in the football club in the early 50s, and there had been a number of years, and again some of you may know more about this than I do, but there were a number of years when there was no club, and some of the local lads had to go to Ballyleck if they wanted to play football. But he got it going again. I was certainly one of the people who played a major part in getting it established, and was the secretary of the club for a number of years in the early 50s. Now, a few years back, a document came into my hands which surprised me. It was a document that had come out from the castle in Dublin to local police forces. And I assume it's an example of one that went all over the country. 26th of the 2nd, 1890. Now, remember 1890, the GAA was just in its infancy. And all the local police stations were being advised. There's one bit here that's interesting. It refers to clubs that have ceased to pay and its affiliation fee to the central branch. So they were taking a particular interest in those for some reason. But they were also told to watch for a change of officers where those have taken place, and if any of them are suspected of belonging to a secret society, it should also be mentioned in the remarks column, giving the name of the society, and if there are any newly formed clubs in the district which do not appear, they have to be entered too. So that went out, came from Dublin out to Enniskillen, and from Enniskillen to Kinawley. And here it gives a list of the local clubs. John Mitchell's was somewhere in the Derry Lynn area. Is Derry Lynn team still called? No? Killymackin, I think, was more towards Timor.
Yeah.
Derricosy would have been over the Liston Ski side of Derry Lynn, and probably would have included people from Acklamad and that area. Drumdooney, or Drumdoney, I think it would be called now, would be Doon. And then there were the Kinawley, Brian, but despite their intelligence, they didn't get the name right, the Brian Baroos. And there were 28 members. It listed the various officers, and where I got the surprise was the secretary was Miles McMullen. Miles McMullen was my grandfather, but also the grandfather of Patrick McManus, after whom the field is named. So there was a long link back there that I was completely unaware of until this document came into my hands. Back to the hall. The hall was used for other events. There was a badminton club which continued on and off for 20 years or more. And there are some veterans of that club here too. Ian Leonard, not only did he score points for Kinawley, but he was quite a useful badminton player. And there was, I remember we used to throw darts. There was a wee hut up at the back of the hall. We used to throw darts up there. But the big event of the year was the bazaar. And it really was a major event in the year. The couple of records that I have of it show it in January, which would seem to me to have been a bad time, after Christmas when the money was spent. And I wonder if it was brought forward in later years to before Christmas, but maybe not. The bazaar was, the stage would be packed with prizes. Paddy Riley from Raffy was the main man. He announced all the prizes. He was in charge of the rickety wheel. He presented the prizes and did the whole lot very, very efficiently. And there was a team of girls, and it was all girls in those days, selling tickets. I remember Agnes and Maggie Maguire and Mary McBarn. Who else would it be?
Maureen Keenan.
And the Currys,
Sarah,
James
Sarah.
Curry's sisters.
Sarah, yeah.
Bridget Gillies too. Bridget, Mrs. McCann's sister, Bridget Gillies.
Bridget Gillies, yeah. So they were, and they were fully committed. And on busy nights, especially on the last night, they really, I was going to say they earned their money. They didn't get any money, but they had to work hard. And it didn't matter whether you were a youngster, as I was in the early days, or an old person, or somewhere in between. It was just a great social occasion. And it wasn't just tickets, there was a wheel of fortune. James McConnell and Frank Keenan, I remember being responsible for that, and they were, you'd think they were professionals listening to them. There was an air gun, again, no worries about health and safety, and various other games. And you could also get tea in a bun. And the last night was, the floor I think used to be covered was a sawdust to protect the dance floor.
That's right, yeah.
Now, all my memories of Terugin are not good. Across the road from us, in the house where Kevin lives today, lived the McManus family. And there were 9 in the family. By the time I knew them, the eldest, Hugh and Thomas and Winnie, they had left, although I remember them being back on holiday. Or Hugh anyway. Hugh had gone to America, I think, and Tom went to Canada. Mona was training to be a nurse and later on owned a nursing home in England. Charlie looked after the farm. And then there was Lawrence, Kathleen. Kathleen and my youngest of my sisters, Peggy, were very close friends. They were the same age. And even though they went in different directions, they stayed in touch over the years until my sister died in 2010. And the last I heard of Kathleen, she was living down in Cork, and she may still be there. She would be about 85 now. And then there was Leo, and the youngest was Jimmy. Now, Jimmy was a couple of years older than me, but he and I would have played together a lot. We'd have been back and forward to each other's houses frequently. He looked after me when I started school, and he would have been over in our house playing Ludo and drafts frequently. But in June of 1954, the 2nd of June, he went fishing up the Holmes River, down from the Hump.
I remember the evening quite well.
And it was a nice warm evening, and he decided to get into bed.
Hugh Lunny was with him.
That's right.
He changed the Calishua School from Kinawley.
That's right.
Became friends with Hugh.
And Hugh wouldn't go in. Jimmy went in, and it's a treacherous river. It was known to be because of holes in it, and he just suddenly disappeared and was drowned. His body wasn't recovered until the next morning. Nigel Keys got out in the boat there.
I remember them bringing in a boat, carrying in a boat along the river that evening. And there was an awful lot of people there. I could watch it from the house.
It was it hit the whole community very hard. There's one image that has never left my mind. I don't know how long it was afterwards. It might have only been a few days, or it could have been several days, but I was out at the front of the house one day, and I saw the local sergeant. He was the Sergeant Fairley,
Yes.
coming up from the hall, coming up the lane from the hall, and he was carrying something. And as he came to the front of the house, Mrs. McManus came out and she screeched, "You're bringing me Jimmy's clothes, but you're not bringing me Jimmy." And that scene has never really left me. The village of Kinawley at that time, I probably wouldn't have been in it very often at night, but I do remember going to midnight mass, and it was a dark place. There was no street lighting. I remember candles up in the windows, but I am sure there must have been the tilly lamps again in the church. Although I don't think the candles.
I don't think that is electricity come to 1950.
It might have even been, well, it might have been in the church, but it was later when it came to light up the streets, because this was a letter that was sent in sometime after 1953, in which this guy, he's complaining about how slow the electricity has been, that some houses were wired 4 years before this. But it wasn't until Christmas 1953, people who went to midnight mass in Kinawley a few weeks ago were deeply impressed by the excellence of the street lighting. It's hard to imagine Kinawley now without street lighting, but at those days it would have been people coming along, some on bicycles, many of them walking with their flash lamps, and mostly flash lamps, and torches. And speaking of torches reminds me of something else. Again, let's go back to my brother. He got himself a little, I think it was a Royal Enfield motorbike, and he also got 2 torches which he got welded together, so there was a long, but more batteries in it, and it was more powerful. And he used to go out lamping rabbits. And we had a little dog, and when he wanted to get on the motorbike, the dog used to jump up on the petrol tank in front of him, and off they would go. And it was illegal, of course, but rabbits were plentiful. This was before the maximitosis came in, and off he would go. And the idea was, if you shone a torch, the torch beam on a rabbit, the rabbit froze, and the little dog just run down the beam of light and kill the rabbit. Dreadful by today's standards, but in those days, I think that you got quite well paid for the skin of a rabbit. 3 and 6 seems to stick in my mind, but that's true or not, I don't know. Would it have been as much as that?
2
shillings? Well, even 2 shillings, just he was 2 shillings would have got you into the dance with the buried in starting show. So Kinawley got lit up, but it wasn't just a dark place in the early 50s, it was also at times a smelly place. Certainly if you were down around the back of the school, but the toilets were, well, that wasn't the place where you would want to linger, because there was no running water. And the mid-50s was an important time. September 1954, a contract was given to bring water to Kinawley. Scotland's of Ernston got the contract. And I think it was brought from Carew.
Well, up in Canada.
Later on, it was Marble Arch, was it then? But the original supply came from Carew. And in the years after this, other places like Thompson's Bridge and so on began to look for the water supply that was in Kinawley to be extended.
There was a company, Corey's from Omer,
That's right, they were from Dungannon.
or Dungannon down that direction anyway.
Yeah, Henry Corey.
Yeah.
As a
They were at that as well.
schoolboy, I worked there.
Yeah, Paddy, my father worked on it as well.
Yeah.
And they got 10 yards a time to dig. That was dug from Kinawley to Kinawley. And that was in 1954. But Henry Corey was the contractor now. Well, the Scotland may have sublet it to Corey.
Scholars were quite
But
big.
I remember there was two. One of them stayed in Tom Maguire's, and the other one was the one of them stayed in Packy Drums. It was. Some of them stayed in Tom Maguire's anyway. There was a boy, Cyril McFarlane, and he played a couple of matches with Kinawley.
He was useless.
Yeah.
He was useless, Tony.
They don't know what they're going in there. They don't put up by your house from Kinawley to Kestis Cross.
Yeah, they dug it right to
Spades.
yeah, you got 10 yards at a time. Packy would know it. Packy was digging on it.
Yeah.
Him and the father.
Yeah.
And,
10 yards.
that was my first job on that, and that was lighting the wee lamps when the thing was, when the sign was through out on the road. There were lamps lit on 3 sides with a red light. I lit them at night and my father put them out in the morning.
And you were well paid for
I
it.
got 10 shillings a week
Not bad at all.
in 1954.
So Kinawley was moving on with electricity and running water. Before that, there had just been a couple of wells. And Packy, you've written about these in your book.
They probably have.
One of them was behind the old barracks. There was a pump there.
Yeah. That was
And when we lived there, the pump was still there, but it didn't work anymore, and there's no need for it, of course.
Yeah, but Tony would also remember going to the pump from school. You had to go in pairs. It was often times right before you came back. Because you had to sort of feed water into the top of the pump and keep pumping it. So somebody had to be, there was always, to put it just in as short as possible, there always had to be a half a bucket of water left there.
That was to prime up the pump.
Prime up the pump, you know. But it was good water. But I seen the well when my wires were doing up the place their pot property and it's in the middle of the floor.
Yeah, he's a cover of a stone.
Yeah.
I think I might have taken part of that pump, the handle or something. I think I might have taken it away with me.
You shouldn't
And
have.
I might still have it somewhere. So, the water was in, the electricity was in, but there hadn't been much change in the housing. Then, in March 1955, it was announced that 6 council houses would be built around Mullingar. And as those houses went up, there was great interest in who would become the tenants. And there was plenty of people in the area, including my own family, who could have been doing with one of these houses. They were completed and allocated by me in 1956, and I'm afraid none of the local people, well, almost none of the local people who had applied became tenants. However, George Veach, who owned the shop that Michael has down there now, George lived in the side of the old barracks towards Derry Lane. The old barracks there was 2 houses there. And George got one of the houses. In fact, I think it was the first house when you went in. And that, of course, left a vacancy in Kinawley. And when my mother heard that, she decided right away that she would go and talk to Wilson Crawford, who owned the old barracks. Wilson had a shop and a farm over at Thompson's Bridge, where Willie Cather lives there now.
Yeah, the pub was one time there too.
And there had been a pub there earlier. And my father and I the rest of the family were all in England by then. My father and I thought she was crazy. There's no chance. She came home with the key. Now, Winston Crawford had, I think it originally came from above Stragaud Cross, where his brother Bobby lived. And my mother and him, of course, would have been about the same age, and they would have known each other's growing up. Anyhow, we moved in to where George Veitch had vacated as tenants. And if you can imagine what things were like in most houses in 1956, we moved into a house where there was electricity, running water, hot water, an indoor toilet, a bathroom. There was even a hot press. And all we had to do was walk across the road to go to Mass, or I had to walk across to go to school, or later on just walk outside and catch the bus, and the shops were beside us. And at the time I didn't think much of it, but when I was actually thinking about what I was going to say tonight, it really occurred to me just what a change and how lucky we were. It was wonderful from our point of view, although, as I say, I was 10 at that stage and didn't worry an awful lot about it. We lived there, well, I left, I went away then in 1964. Over the years, the other side of the house, there were different tenants. I remember a policeman called Burns living in it for a while. Joe McKiernan, Mrs. McKiernan, who was the teacher in the school, they lived there for several years when the family were small. I remember a Crawford, Andy Crawford, living there with a house full of young children. I think some of them still live down about Arney. And then sometime towards the end of the 60s, John Maguire came to live there. And it was around that time, or soon after, maybe 69 or 70, that Winston Crawford decided to sell the building. Now, I'm quite sure he had come in for a fair bit of criticism when he took us in as tenants. And no doubt he got even maybe more criticism because he wanted us to buy our side of the house, and that's what we did. And John Maguire bought his. So that's how it became a Maguire building. My parents lived there for the rest of their days. My father died in 1980, but my mother lived on there until just shortly before her death in 1994. But the house remained in the family. My sister and her husband Jerry Boyd owned it, and they used to come and go, you know, they used it as a holiday home, and their family and some of my other sisters would have used it as well. So it stayed in the family until sometime around maybe 2006, 2007. They were made an offer that they just couldn't refuse. A developer had a number of sites up behind, but had no way of getting up to them, no roadway. And there was a wide path, or a wide area that went up past our house, and he wanted this to make a roadway. And so, he, as I said, he made an offer that they couldn't refuse. Unfortunately for him, of course, 2008, the whole slump came, and the houses that he had planned to have the road up to were never built. And then the bank became the owner, and I don't know how long that was for, but eventually it was put up for sale again, and the Maguire, one of the Maguire, which is the owns it?
Martin. No, it's Martin, my brother owns it.
Martin. Martin bought the whole lot then, and of course we all know the wonderful job he has done is just an amazing building now, and has been extended and developed. So that was, 1956 we came to live there. And the Kinawley that I remember from that time, as far as I remember, that was the makeup of the village. I refer to the shops as general stores. Peter Cairns and George Feaches, they weren't just grocery shops, they sold just about everything. Animal feeding stuff, and oil, and everything that was needed. And they had a big catchment area around it. My memory of some of the shops, especially Feaches, was that around in the middle of the day especially, it was mostly men who seemed to do the shopping. Now, some of them were farmers already who'd come out in their vans, but it was unusual in that there were so many men you would see at the shops. Although they weren't all in vans, there was one man up the Sonnebar Road, and I think he was certainly in the 50s, he was still coming down in his donkey and cart. Tom Muldoon. Remember him, Emma? Tom, in fact, I remember sitting in the school, and it was very quiet, of course, in that black and white world that existed at the time. And there wouldn't be much noise, but occasionally, on the odd days, you would hear Tom going past his donkey and cart.
Johnny Riley at Brockton.
Johnny
Riley. Horse and cart.
In the horse and cart. And I also seem to remember, now it might have been earlier, but another Riley, Black Paddy Riley, in a trap, would have come maybe to Mass or coming up the road in a pony and trap. Would that have been the early 50s?
Frank Riley's father.
Frank's father, yeah.
I don't have any many skill with that, on that trap one time.
You got it?
Skilling, yes. It was, I think it was the fair day, 10th of August, and I think it fell on a holiday off. So my father sent me out with him. He had got a jar of port, but there was a haystack on the way. So he left at the end of the road, big crappy jar of port.
And was that for you or for the...
The men at the haystack.
Yeah, that is got to be my name for some reason.
Do you remember the cinema that was in Kinawley?
Oh, I didn't know. Come on to that. That's, you couldn't miss that. There was also the bicycle shop. Now, again, in my early memories of Charlie Mitten's bicycle shop was a bicycle shop, and it was busy because so many people used bicycles at the time. Now, later on, as the bicycle business sort of dwindled, Charlie diversified and found other means of income. There was the post office, one school, 2 churches, 1 hall. Well, the other hall, of course, was down at Taruga, but in the village itself, there was just the one. There was 1 police station, doctor's surgery, and I may be exactly right here, but I think there was 13 dwelling houses.
There was a cobbler shop. There was a wee cobbler. Mainly pitched.
Yeah, he would have come a bit later.
All right.
And he had that wee wooden shed beside Veitch's.
That's right.
There was also a barber.
Paddy Maguire.
Johnny Maguire, down behind Veitch's, when you went down the slope at the side, I think on Saturday nights, Lawrence Shannon from Acklemag used to come over and cut hair there. So it really was, Kinawley really was the centre of butcher shop for him area.
Was a butcher shop for him and some paper road.
Yeah, was there a butcher shop up at this end?
Around the front there.
Just maybe beside where we are here, James, the only one I
Who had it?
Ronnie Crawford had it, that's right.
That's right, I've forgotten about that.
There wasn't much demand for meat at that time.
No. And mention of James Leone reminds me, of course, James Leone also kept worked up the road in the second-hand clothes shop of Hugh Collins, and there was more of a demand for what they sold there now than for the meat packet.
You could be dressed for a wedding there.
And I'm sure many one was.
Yeah.
This is the old senior. There was a wee shop like Brian's there opposite the football field as well.
Yeah.
Oh, up the road, yeah.
Another second-hand shop where what they used to call Lanty Hall.
I usually owns at the second-hand shop there.
Well, that was a different one from Hugh Collins.
Oh, it was, aye.
All right, I was thinking
No.
they were the same.
And there was one up in Caldera, wasn't there? There's a second-hand shop up in Caldera, where Q Roddy's house is now, up there. There's a second-hand house up in Caldera. Wasn't there one up there? Q Cullen run it, or the Cullens run it in the past.
Next to the shop in town as well.
There's a wee shop of a tour.
Just before you went to the
Yeah, and there's another at the border, but it's called Bunchy Murray, like Clark's.
That was other side.
Well, the Blades have a shop up there.
Yeah.
Because McConnell, you know, who went on to be an international musician with the Voice of the Law, Cahill.
I'll take this story about that.
Cahill McConnell, Cahill used to work in that shop.
Yeah.
That was a big shop. Yeah.
They sent them for a book of the water one morning down to the spring, and Sunday after dinner they discovered that he hadn't gone back. And one of the lassies from down, Benny Galbraith worked in it, and Jim Maguire worked in it, despite that he was behind for a while. They were down and he went to have a six on the bucket of clear away.
Oh, that.
Never picked them back.
The buildings that I remember from that time, the police station, my early memory of the police station was just a big white building with a very nice lawn in front of it. And I remember David Hunter used to mow the lawn. But that all changed. We came out from school one afternoon, I suppose it was probably early 1957, and we noticed a lot of unusual activity down at the police station. And some of us went down to see what was going on, and there were men in strange uniforms taking large coils of barbed wire off trucks. And we were talking to them for a while. We'd probably never seen any British Army before that. I remember that evening, the word came through to our house and probably to the houses of whoever was with me that this wasn't a good idea. We weren't to go
Down
back.
there again.
We weren't to go back down there and talk to these people again. So you learn quickly.
And at that time was the barracks where it was then?
Yeah, it was in the same place. I'm not sure when the move from the old barracks to that new barracks.
1922.
So
I don't think it was built in 22 though, even. That's when the RAC finished. Because
1932.
32. Because I remember a man telling me about how he was involved in some activities that the police were taking a particular interest in, except that he used to come down from the hill down through the garden to the side of the house and slip in there and talk to some of the policemen and would have given them some donations so that when he was doing other things they wouldn't interfere with him. And that would have been certainly the 20s and maybe even the early 30s, so 32 the move was. So that was my memory of the police station. My earlier memory had been that there was an area of sort of unused or wasteland beside it, but then Charlie Mitten built a beautiful big house there. And that must have been about the mid-50s that I think he built it. I remember being down because I was quite friendly with some of Charlie's family. It was Janet and Joy and Trevor and John.
Valerie.
Valerie was it? Yeah, Valerie. And Joy was speech. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a Gary and then a younger, the younger ones.
Alan. There was John and Alan and Gary. Trevor.
Trevor was the eldest of ones, yeah. And the house that they moved out of, then, and again it had a nice lawn down the front of it. Bobby Brown, he would have moved in there with his family. And then just beside the turn up to here, there was another house, but by 56 I don't think there was anyone living there, but McQuaid's had lived there.
Frank McQuaid. He used to dig wells. He was he dug wells, Frank. He had a son Michael and a daughter Agnes. Aggie McQuaid. She was married to Ray Owens.
Well, that reminds me actually, going back to the electricity, when the electricity was being put in, I remember coming to school one morning and being scared. My brother worked for the electricity board, putting up the poles and connecting the wires. And as I came up, he was at the top of a pole just opposite the gable wall of the school, the corner of Peter Carnes, the end of the road there. And he was at the top of it, and I remember being scared that this brother of mine was going to fall from this great height. He worked with the electricity board for a while. The others I remember working with him at that time were Tom and Andy Murphy from Derry Lynn, Paddy Martin from Timor. There was a man called Fairley Fox who
was the manager.
was English.
John Green's had out of it in there.
John. And some of Fairley's family still live around Enniskillen.
Pierce lives in Noma.
And there's a daughter, Una.
Una and Josephine lives in Enniskillen.
And there was Jim McIntyre, who drove the truck and was a boxer, or had been a boxer. And when the Silver Sandal Ballroom opened, he became one of the bouncers, and the other bouncer was the man you've mentioned, Ray Owens.
Leo High.
He was there too.
Anyhow, to get back to my memory of the village then, there was, coming on up, Peter Carn, of course, owned the shop, and where the pub is now, or approximately where the pub is now, was their dwelling house. Mrs. Carn, I remember Mrs. Carn as being a formidable woman, one you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of. Peter used to go to Enniskillen with Charlie Mitten every Thursday. And it was his day out, and he would have a few drinks when he was in Enniskillen. And I remember being outside the shop on one evening, and Charlie had a beautiful big white car, a new car. And as he stopped, Peter went to get out. He had a large bundle of sausages with him to sell in the shop. But as he got out, he fell. And the sausages fell. And Mrs. Karen came out, and she was not happy. And she got him into the house anyway, and she got back out a while later, and there was a wee man who lived down Graffy called Tommy Len. And Tommy was standing there, he was a timid wee man, and Tommy said, Mrs. Karen, those sausages there, you might be as well to pick those up in case the dog would come and eat them. She said, you hit the fire quickly yourself. It was all the thanks Tommy got for his good deed. Now, Peter Cairn's shop, if I have time, I'll come back to it, because it's too important to just glance over. And the same with the school. The school and Cairns, I always thought of as the sort of the social centre of the village, between the two, and the two were connected in many ways. On the other side of the road, of course, was Norman Crawford's. There was a bit of an orchard, I think, between his house and the Orange Hall. And then there was the school.
There was a man, McBride, had a garage there as well, and he had the garage outside the Sligo Road there afterwards. He had Norman's, Tony, you might remember it as well. He had Norman's, one of Norman's sheds, he worked at cars in it. He was McBride.
I worked in it anyway. I worked in the same shed
I know you did,
many years after.
Do you remember McBride in it?
No, I can't say that I do now, no.
No, well, he had,
But did Norman Crawford own it at that stage? Or
Yeah.
James Henry Crawford?
no, Norman Crawford owned it. Oh, and James Henry, went over to Tony,
James Henry Crawford was there a good way before.
Yeah,
I think Norman Crawford would have been down in the post office at the time.
yeah.
My father used to work with James Henry Crawford.
Between the,
When you're talking about James Henry, he had a quarry in the road where I am,
Aye, that's right.
Yesteryear. Your father would have worked in it.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, the quarry stones there and
Yeah.
were brought in horses and cars like to repair roads, and
It was
most of the Raffia Road there was made from the stones from.
Will Crawford to be on his farm now.
we're moving on through then, between, well, it's between where the new development is there now, where the shop, Peter Cairns shop was, and Freehouse, it's still the same, I think, there's nothing else there. Freehouse, Tom and Anne were the old couple. Tommy was the son, and Mary, I'm not sure when Tommy married, Mary Gillies. Mary's still there, isn't she? Tom, old Tom as we call him, I always thought he should have been in the Guinness Book of Records, because he had been a policeman, an RAC man, and he had retired in 1922. And then he got married. And 50 years later, they celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. And I wonder if there's anyone else in the country who celebrated, who was retired before they got married, but still celebrated the golden wedding anniversary. And it must have been some sort of a record, I think. Tom lived a sort of a retired life of a gentleman. He had a very distinguished moustache.
He had a taxi car for a while too.
Yeah, and he used to do some pools or other.
Huh?
He did some pools.
That's right,
Pools or something like that.
Yeah.
And
He did insurance too.
That was young Tommy. You were talking about the father.
the father.
And the father.
How
The
many
other thing I
years?
remember about old Tom is the first blink of sun would come early in June, he'd appear with the straw hat. And the weather was sure to break as soon as he came out with it.
Was he not married twice?
I don't think so. His wife was
Gone.
gone.
And gone.
Anna gone.
Tom used, then when the grandchildren came along, Tom came into our house nearly every night to watch the news, because he couldn't, the noise was too much with the young children. And I got to know him fairly well, and I used to watch him. When an ad would come on the TV, I think it was mostly Smithwick's at the time, an ad would come on for beer anyway. You see the little snails here. But the police training never left him, because the other thing we noticed, when he'd go out at night, if there was a car parked over about the priest's house or the chapel gates, you'd see Tom go over and bend down and checking the number plate.
I had telling one about old Mr. Free. He became a sergeant. And he was got drunk the first day, lost it. You know, a policeman, sergeant for one day.
That would fit all right. Well, then there was the old barracks, and I mentioned the people that lived there. But there was only one other house on the left-hand side between where we lived and Mullingar Road, and that was Dr. Curran's. It was roughly opposite the...
But those houses are built now.
Yeah, It was opposite the old graveyard. It wasn't as far down as the post office.
But there used to be a wee shop there as well.
And then on the left, on this side of it, there was a
Agnes Maguire.
shed. Now, I vaguely, was it Kathleen Maguire, the sister of Agnes?
Aye, Kathleen,
She had a
yes.
second tool shop there.
Some kind of a second hand or pawn shop or
That's
something.
right.
But in the waste ground between our house and down close to that shed, which had a tin or iron roof on it, there was an old headstone
I know what you're talking about.
laying flat. And at times when we'd be hanging out, as the Americans would say, we speculate about this headstone and why it was there. Now I think it was one that had been cut wrongly or something was just abandoned. But there was other different stories about it, and there was one night, a few of us were there and we were talking about this, and there was a dare of who would go and lay down on it.
Lay down on
And Mickey Fetty,
it. That's right.
Mickey, he was brave enough and he wasn't afraid, and Mickey went down and stretched himself out on the headstone, and just as he did, we unleashed a barrage of
Stones on the iron roof.
onto the iron roof.
He came up with that height without.
Yeah, he didn't jump up, he just levitated. Scared the wits out of him. There was another story, I think it was a Mrs. McManus had lived in that house back earlier, and was a teacher.
That's right. Talking to Kinawley.
Yeah, and there was a story that she had buried sovereigns somewhere up the garden. And it was either in some sort of a container, these sovereigns, when the sovereigns went out of, stopped being used or whatever. And there was speculation then about when the new houses were being built, that somebody was going to find these sovereigns. Now if they did, it was never revealed. Down the other side of the road then was the post office, Mrs. Crawford and her son Walter, and what their father that we would have referred to as old Bobby. And every morning at some time, I think it was shortly after 8 o'clock, you could nearly set your clock to Bobby walking past our house and on up and up to the farm where the son lives up there now.
Grandson.
Grandson. And Bobby had a distinct walk. He walked with a stick at that stage, and I think he dragged one foot of it. You'd know his walk anyway. Now, I only remember having one conversation with him, and I must have been 11 or 12 or so at the time. And he stopped me one day to talk to me, and he asked me had I heard of Seamus McManus, or had I read his book, The Rocky Road to Dublin. No, I don't remember whether I knew of him at that time or not. But Bobby must have been old enough. Seamus McManus taught for most of the year in Kinawley, about 1889 or 1890. And years afterwards, I did read the book. If any of you ever get your hands on it, if you haven't already read it, please do. There's a whole chapter in it on Kinawley, but the rest of the book is very, very readable, very funny, a lot of folklore. He was from Donegal and he writes a lot about his home place. So Bobby was very interested to see had I known about this, and he talked to me about it and about Seamus McManus. He probably remembered him because Bobby, I'm sure, was probably 10 or maybe more when Seamus McManus was here teaching in Kinawley. And have many of you read it?
Yeah. He did another one as well, a lot of the O'Freels.
Oh yeah, he was.
Master Corbin gave it to me, he must have noticed I was a bit of a reader. And he told me at that time that that man, Seamus McManus, he says, taught in the school here. And I was amazed at it, you know.
Well, I think even though some of you may have seen this before, but I think if the night that's in it, I think it's worth my while to put up a few extracts. This is where he talks. He refers to himself as the boy. He was a young teacher. And this is how he describes himself coming to Kinawley. And been mithered by the 5 pints and the 7 pints and a dozen common crossroads. And he goes on, he says the 6 miles that was supposed to be from Florence Court, the 300 Florence Court to Kinawley, it was more like 16. He was looking for Master Anderson, who lived at the end of a mile-long lane running from the highway. And the boy, as he calls himself, searched to the muddy end every lane he came up with. And at the very tail end of each, he found a lighted cottage. But none of them the one he wanted. It was always, try a lane a wee bit ahead of you on the left for the master. When he did find it, far into the night, the thatched cottage he was searching, he found welcome and rest, a comfortable home, and a master of fatherly mien, generous proportions, soft kindliness of speech, and deep earnestness of manner, an engaging middle-aged bachelor, reposeful and confidence-inspiring. Master Andy Anderson, a struggling country schoolmaster, proved to be a noble-minded, true gentleman, whose sterling character should influence for good the forming character of the boy. God rest you, Andy Anderson, 'tis many that the prince might have been proud to be you. Now what better tribute can you have to your great-grandfather than that? And I won't read all of this, but there's another couple of extracts. He talks there about the importance of Master Anderson. He often wasn't in the school because he was out at funerals, settling a quarrel, seeing a sick friend, drawing up a will, aborting a threatened lawsuit, making a match, sponsoring a christening, giving away a bride, sitting in on consultation, and so on. And the boy was still far from big. Here he had to rule a crowd of lads bigger than himself. But they were gentler, far, civiller, and 10 times more tractable than the rioters of Enniskillen. He had taught for a while in the model school in Enniskillen. And then, going back another generation, once you got to know Master Anderson, the two of them used to go off carrying at night, and he talks about how they fell into drains and all the rest. And then in the mornings, Master Anderson's father, Neddy, used to be rapping the floor to get them up. And you can probably read that yourselves. You could see the road, black with pupils, crowds of pupils waiting for them. And get up, I'm telling you again, if the Lord hasn't saved it, the pair of you will wind up like old Mickey Maguire.
He was a famous man.
Mickey Maguire was the teacher before Master Anderson, and he was a sort of a link between the old hedge schools and the national schools. And again, he writes about him. But there's one little bit here which I think is I like this bit anyway. He talks about him, and again it shows how witty McManus was. And he talks about old Mickey writing songs and so on. And he loved with Joe once to live out the night. He didn't like work, and he especially disliked both the day's forepart, the morning, and his demands. Indeed, he often said that it was a sad mistake anyhow to have the day begin in the morning. And when he was the master of Kinawley, morning would have long lost its novelty if it wasn't worn out entirely when you reached the school, and sometimes you forgot to reach it.
Paddy, before he taught in the school there, he taught in a wee shack down Graffy. That's where he taught for us, Mickey Maguire.
Down Graffy.
Yeah, down beside the bridge there.
Seamus also tells a story about when there was floods, and it might have been down Graffy, which often was flooded.
Yeah.
Some of the older boys would carry him across the flood.
That's right,
But it wasn't unknown for these boys to suddenly get in the middle of the flood. But I like this story, this bit here. There was a a sergeant, he referred to him as the gambler, and he wasn't prepared to put up with old Mickey being late and sometimes not turning up. And he wrote to the master, giving him a rap on the knuckles. He said, "Masters should be punctual in their attendance." And when Mickey read this, he said, "That's very excellent, child. And now let me set you another good headline." Apparently, as it says there at the beginning, this policeman didn't always send Mickey the few pennies, or the penny that he was supposed to send at the beginning of the week. So Mickey set down this other headline, a small specimen of poetry that you're to copy 10 times under your father's eye. Sergeants should be punctual in their pay, otherwise have less to say. Now, Seamus talks about another Maguire, Frank Maguire, who wrote a lot of poetry. And Seamus and him had and again it shows the way things have changed. They had a competition. Was that where he was from?
Yeah.
Because I was wondering about, in my young days, there was a John Maguire, Black John as we call him, who lived up the Lanty Road. And he used to write a bit of poetry.
Oh, he was deadly.
He wrote a poem. There was a policeman in Kinawley, MacGyver was he?
Yeah.
Who was particularly officious. I remember when we were living in Tarugin, he came in to us once because the dog had barked at him from the bank. He wasn't on the road around, he just barked down at him, and MacGyver came in to tell us off. So I thought there might have been a link between the Franklin and the John. But now, I know I'm straying away a bit from the village and what the place was like, but I can't go on without mentioning another writer. By the way, I checked on Amazon, and there's one copy of The Rocky Road to Dublin, a hardback copy for sale, £88. There's one paperback, a second-hand paperback for £6 or £7, but that's all. It's out of print, of course, long ago. And in the same way, this book is out of print now, but again there are a couple of second-hand copies available on Amazon. It's James Boyce's Late. Have many of you heard of that?
I read it.
It's written by a man called Claypole, who came to Stragona School about 1947 to 50, or 48 to 50. And for those who can remember the people at that time, it makes very interesting reading, because he writes a lot about, well, it's a real social history at the time, but he also describes his neighbours and all the people that lived around. He changes their names, but he keeps the initials the same. So the Ohms family, for instance, became the O'Neills, and Pat Carn became Paddy Cowan, I think. You know, the initials are the same, but the names are different. And it really is a wonderful read. Even the nicknames, he changed those. Joe Stepper became John the Strider. And was it Jenny Deck? Became James the Dealer. You know, he kept the same sort of nickname. When I read the book, he had come back to England and became principal of a primary school in England. But when he retired, he came back, he retired to, obviously he had fallen in love with Ireland, he came back to live in Port Stewart. And when I read the book, he calls Kinawley, Kinawley, Derry Lynn is Derry Lund. So he's just changed, you know every place he's talking about. I wrote to him and got a very nice letter back. And then I got a phone call one day. He was back in Kinawley and wanted to, him and his wife wanted to call and see him, which they did, and they were a lovely couple. And we had a long chat, and he wrote to me afterwards and asked me to come and visit him in Port Stewart, and of course I put it off, and I never did. And he's dead now for quite a few years. Now, there's just one quotation that I want to put up for purely selfish reasons. He talks about this funeral of Mrs. Malone. It was a melancholy sight to see the bearers emerge from the mist with their heavy burden. The sad cortege came slowly and carefully down to the waiting hearse, which then set off on its way to Kinawley Chapel, followed by a long procession of men who had now ceased their chattering and walked silently and reverently. The only bright spot of that gloomy day was that despite the bad weather, so many had gathered. Mrs. Malone was Mrs. Mullen, or Mrs. MacMullen, my grandmother. And I don't remember her. She died in 1949, but that was a particularly poignant. He writes more about her. He talks about it up in the house with her and so on. But that was the bit that I particularly appreciated. But to get back to Kinawley, round Mulligarrow, there was the 6 houses, but before you came to the 6 houses, there were 2 other houses. Mannings lived in what was then a 2-storey house, but in an unusual, in a reverse of what usually happens, it was lowered. And it's still there as a bungalow, is it?
Yeah.
And then Bertoni of Collins, a house where I, again, would have frequently visited. Mannings, at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, I worked as a school inspector. And one of the schools in Belfast that I had occasion to visit was one of the big grammar schools, Strathern Girls Grammar School. And I got to know the principal there quite well. And over a number of weeks, we were doing some work together. His name was David Manning. And I said to him one day, you know, I've only ever once met or known anyone called Manning. And they lived in the village, the wee village in Kinawley that I grew up in. Kinawley, he said? The guy said yes. It turned out David was the son of one of the Mannings. I think it was Dudley.
Dudley, he died there. Dudley Manning died some time back there, I think. No.
Well, David had an unusual boast. He said he was the only head teacher that was also a qualified bricklayer. As a young fella, he had served his time with his father.
Dudley Manning and Francie College and other Manning. It's them houses that you were talking about in
Mulligar?
Yeah. He mightn't have built them all, but certainly my father attended them too, man.
Well, the next time I met him, I gave him a photograph. It's more from Acclamad School, 1935. And there were 4 of the Mannings.
Iris Manning is a sister of Dudley's. There was an Iris Manning in it.
Iris, there's Albert and Doris. I assume they're all.
And there was a Thomas in it as well.
The other thing that indicates is that schools, you know, we're talking about integrated education now. Schools in those days were very often mixed. There might have been a majority of Catholics, but there were non-Catholics at the schools, and Acclamad is an example of that. The same would have been the case for the Rumbruchas, where some of the Beatties or Beatties would have gone there.
See a Jude Catholic on it, with the same probably Catholics that were on the room.
Willie Gillies in the pub, isn't that down the bottom?
Willie Gillies, yeah.
O'Hara.
So I brought him that photograph, and he was delighted, brought it home to his father, and of course the fact that I had made the link and recognised it was special.
Winterson.
Now, as it so happened at that time, another school that I had to call in was Banbridge Academy. And the principal there was Winston Breen, from up the road. And Winston was a few years older than me, and when I called with him, he didn't recognise me, he didn't remember until I explained to him who I was. And he couldn't have been more welcome then. And I remember the school had just been, most of it had been rebuilt, and he took me on a big tour of the whole school and made me very welcome. And a while after that, I was asked by the Department of Education to serve on a working party with 7 or 8 others to look at what were called teacher competences, to identify what teachers in the 1990s, what skills and so on they needed. And one of the other people on it was Winston Breen. And over a number of months, we would have met and eventually published a booklet that went out to all the schools. And sometimes when I was sitting at those meetings in Belfast around the table, I used to think, wasn't it strange that 2 fellas from a wee place like Kinawley, that the others who were in the group would think was at the back of beyond, that 2 of us were there working together, and 2 whose parents had actually grown up on adjoining farms because the Breens owned the land down at the bottom of Carn. So it used to strike me as interesting anyhow. Now, I said I would get back to the centre of the community.
Was there always a Protestant school in Sagona down the centuries or whatever, or was it mixed? Was Kinawley School ever mixed?
No. Sagona was there for a long time anyhow. But you see, if you go back further, there were schools all over the place, because everyone walked, and there was a lot of schools, even in her time. You had Cardew and Drumbrockus, Ansley, Russell, but there were also schools in Carrimean at one time, and several others. I remember years ago reading, I was amazed at how many schools. But of course the population, especially before the famine and indeed afterwards, was huge. The school, I'm not going to talk about what went on inside the school. James Curran and his sister Mrs. McCarthy were the teachers when I was there. One other thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about Moher Meadow. I was coming, it opened about, it was 1958, Paddy, or?
Yeah, I read about that.
And it must have been about 59, maybe 60. I was coming down from practicing in the field. We were probably coming home early on a Sunday afternoon because we'd have had to go to devotions at 5 o'clock. And my cousin Sean McManus was giving me a lift on the bar of the bicycle. And John Francis Gillese he was with us. And I'm sitting on the bar of the bicycle and I'm looking sideways, of course. And as you come down, somewhere about probably where John Patrick, maybe not far from where you live now, on the left-hand side there was a wide grass verge, and it must have been early in the summer because the grass was high. And because I was looking sideways, I noticed a wheel of a bicycle. And I stopped the bicycle and we went back. And here was a poor man. He had just coped over into the long grass, and all that was to be seen was the wheel of a bicycle. And even though we didn't know much, we knew that this was serious. His colour was shocking. Tom Jones.
Yeah.
Tom had been coming from having a few drinks and so on at the bar, and must have had a heart attack, whatever, and just went in. There was a woman came along, I'm not sure if this is the right order, but I think she came along in the car. We stopped her, and it turned out she was a nurse. And the advice, of course, was to go and get a priest and the doctor. And Sean and I headed as fast as we could down to Kinawley. The doctor lived in the village at the time. And John Francis was the stay. with the body and this woman. And when I glanced back, John Francis was going as fast as he could in the opposite direction.
I was just down the road in front of you that day, and I looked round and Tom was coming where the gates of the football field is now. And when I was coming back up again, I came home from my tea and was come back to the tea. And Mrs. Drum, Peggy Drum's mother, was out on the road.
And who was he, Tony? Who was this man on the day?
Tom Jones.
We lived down in Condra? Or,
Yeah.
Condra?
He was on the right there with the white house.
Yeah, Jones was still in town.
Exactly, Maguire.
Yeah.
One of those children.
He had a sister, Annie.
Annie, and she was married to... So that was poor Tom. But to get back to the school, it and Peter Cairns were the centre of life in the village. The gable, the fence was back far enough back from the gable to play handball, not with a proper handball, but with a tennis ball. And again, Packy, you've written about this and the importance of handball at the time. It was one of the few, apart from the football, it was about the only on good evenings that you'd have several people there playing, and it was, many of them were very skillful. The school itself was used for meetings and was also used for playing cards. There were card drives, 45, played during the late autumn, and I don't know whether it went on after Christmas or not. But you would have teams of 8 partners playing 45, and the makeup of the different tables would come and go, but there was one table up on the top right hand side, and nobody would dare sit down at that table. It would be more than your life would be worth. That table was reserved for Tommy Cathcart, Marty Crudden, Dr. Curran, Francie McCaffrey,
Jimmy, one of the Shannons, Joe Shannon,
Joe, yeah,
Pat McManus of and Peter Haven, Vinnie Shaw played in it.
yeah, it was reserved.
Yeah.
Now the other tables you could mix, and there might be 5 or 6 tables on them.
Oh, that was all over.
And then the finals. Every time you won, you had to win 3 45s to
Get a ticket.
get a ticket, and then if you had tickets, you. And I remember when I was about 14, I got through to a late stage. I don't think it was the final, but it was the semi-final. And the partner I was drawn with, I was the youngest, but the partner was probably the oldest, Charles Murphy of Clonliffe. Now, if you remember Charles, he wasn't a man that you would want to get on the wrong side of. But him and I got on well because I knew him I used to go fishing with him down in Clonliffe. And we were partners, and there was another couple who were 40 for out. In other words, they only wanted 1 trick. And we were some way behind. We weren't in danger of going out anyway. And I think it was the second last trick. And because I didn't want these guys to go out, I played the jack of trump. And there was a man, an unfortunate man called Charlie Gillies from up about Halloween. Charlie immediately hit me with the fingers. And of course the guys that were waiting to go out at the Ace of Hearts, and they got the next trick and won the whole thing. And then Charles went crazy.
You and I won that one time. In the final.
Did we?
Yeah.
I remember playing a number of years, but you see, the thing that registered with me was Charles, not you.
Another thing that night, and we were getting armfuls of cards. Paddy Maguire said after that we were done out of 7 tricks, and we still won.
What was it, turkeys or something we've got, was it?
I can't remember what we got now, but I thought it was money.
Well, it might have been.
That was money.
That would have been well to do. The other story I remember about the school, and probably went on far too long here.
I'll tell you, another man played in that corner was Benny McKenna.
Benny, that's right. Yeah, Benny. Around the school there was a sort of a rough track that people, if they had no care for their bicycles, could go flying around. And it was okay at this side, but when you got round the back, there was only a little narrow space, and it was up over clay banks and so on. And Lawrence McManus from Tarugan, Lawrence came up one day and he went into the shop. And when he was in, somebody jumped on his bicycle and started flying around the school. Now, in the meantime, a policeman called Livingstone came up on his good policeman's bicycle and put it against the wall. Lawrence came out and looked to see where his bike was, and it was obvious he could see that whoever it was flying around the school on it. And he was, of course, very annoyed, and some of the bright sparks said, "But sure, look, here's his bike there. So why don't you do the same?" And of course, it was the policeman's bike that was right.
Do you remember who the bike was, who the fellow was that was on his bike?
I don't.
Michael McManus.
Michael! Which brings me to Peter Cairns' store. And somebody mentioned there earlier the cinema, and in fact one of the last slides I had was showing 2 films, 2 weeks films in Peter Cairns' cinema, or Peter McCairns' cinema. Peter built a store, must have been again the mid-50s, a good big store down the back, and in there he kept a lot of the animal feeding stuff and stuff for hens and so on that a lot of the people would have bought from him. But there was a cinema in Derry Lane and Lynams. Woods' Hall in Swan Bar showed films, and there was cinemas all over Erbistown, Lisson Ski and so on. So Peter thought he would cash in on this too, and there was a small store between the shop and the big store, and he had holes in the wall appropriate for projector, and he started showing films. And Bobby Brown was the projectionist. And I don't know whether it was that Bobby wasn't a very good projectionist or whether the technology wasn't great, but there used to be a lot of interruptions. Now, there weren't many seats, but there was always the bags of meat and so on, so you could sit on those quite comfortably. And I think it went on for a couple of years anyway. We went there for, that was our local cinema. But we also used the store a lot for playing cards. Eamon, you remember that, Aidan Leonard there too. We would have played, it wasn't 25 or 45, it was poker we played very often. But there were other games as well. And sometimes we even ended up playing in the shop itself. The other side I had here showed Clary Hayden. The Clary Hayden show, because Clary Hayden was one of these shows that travelled around the country. His was probably the last of them, but there have been others. I remember Quinn's being down in, there's a flat field away down, is it Burley's own that there? And there'd be a big tent there.
Was that with Jack Reno? Jack Reno was down Arrow Road one time.
Stackers as well, how they told them.
There were a number of them. The reason I mentioned Quinn's is because about 30 years ago, I was in a hotel way down south somewhere, and I met an American couple and had a drink with them, got chatting with them. And it turned out she was the daughter of one of these Quinns that had been in the travelling show. But the Terry Hayden one was probably the best known and the most successful. And they were very talented. In fact, one of his daughters went on to represent Ireland. What was it? There was 3 of them. Somebody and Twink. Maxie and No, there was Maxie something and Twink. And one of them was Clary Hayden's daughter. There were talented musicians, and they used to put on these plays that were a bit scary. Murder in the Red Barn. And the one that really worried me, and they used to repeat them, of course, was The Face at the Window. And you'd hear this sound of this K coming behind the scenes, and I remember being scared about that. Anyhow, it's time for me to stop. One other thing I remember of Peter's, every so often, maybe once a year or twice a year, there was an auction. We were talking about second-hand clothes. there was an auction of second-hand furniture, and there would be a whole lot of, and it was quite busy because most people in those days didn't go and buy the most expensive new equipment. I stopped at that, probably gave me a